Day two of free agency is in the books. Cody and I discuss the wins and losses for the Texans, along with why Nick Caserio has commitment issues.
And to tie it all in, we want to develop a great team here that we can deliver wins to the city of Houston. We want to deliver a championship here to the city of Houston, and that's what it'll be about.
You are Locked On Texans, your daily Houston Texans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, everybody, to a Wednesday episode of the Locked On Texan podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Be sure to follow us on YouTube under the name Locked On Texans and subscribe to the Locked On Texan podcast on all of the major podcast platforms. I'm John Hickman, and of course, I am joined by Texans credentialed media member and Sports Illustrated's own Cody Davis here to discuss day two of the Houston Texans free agency. And what did it all look like? The Houston Texans traded for Shaq Mason, and that was a big trade for the Houston Texans. I will grade it an A. We'll get to that. Of course, we got to look at Noah Brown being brought over from the Dallas Cowboys. He signed a deal with the Houston Texans. Houston also re-signed Derek Rivers, who missed the entire 2022 season. Brought him back on a one-year deal with the trading of Shaq Mason. The Houston Texans released A.J. Cann, and they also restructured everybody's favorite safety, Eric Murray, to bring him back. They also cleared over $700,000 in cap space. And so, Cody, I think we should start with Shaq Mason. That trade included the Texans and the Buccaneers swapping late-round picks. The Buccaneers will get the Texans' sixth-round selection, while the Texans will receive Tampa Bay's seventh-round pick. So we do know that Houston had 4 sixth-round picks. And if you remember, we talked about, I said, they're not going to use all 4 of those picks. They're going to be used in other places. And so I think that was a steal for the Houston Texans to bring in Shaq Mason to help solidify their offensive line, going right guard, bringing a right guard in. Shaq Mason played in all 17 games and started for the Bucs, playing in 99% of the team's offensive snaps, was one of the best passing blocking guards last season, something that'll help shore up the validity of that right side, him playing along Titus Howard. And he's also going to provide some good run support as well. I do expect for that team to look for a new deal, restructure some things. Houston will have to pay Shaq Mason $8.5 million this season. Cody, when you look at the trading of Shaq Mason, what do you think that means for the future of this offensive line? Because I believe Houston will now probably look to go young and cheap and draft the center in this year's draft. We will see Kenyon Green get better. I think bringing over Shaq Mason is, a tremendous vet to have him coach him up. Kenyon Green, who will be going into his second year. But I do think they will go young and cheap, draft a center to be their next starting center. But when you look at bringing in Shaq Mason over from the Bucs, what is your impact? What is his impact in your opinion?
That the Houston Texans actually learn from a past mistake, and that is putting your potential rookie quarterback that you want to be your franchise quarterback in the best position to succeed. You already know they need weapons. Your backfield is pretty solid with Dameon Pierce, but at the end of the day, we all remember it. Deshaun Watson's rookie campaign offensive line was terrible. Second year, Deshaun Watson offensive line was terrible. I believe he finished the season with 62 sacks. Plus, you also got to consider his injury. However, I also want to mention this. Speaking of rookie quarterbacks, I wonder, does this actually means more so Bryce Young over CJ, given his smaller stature? You don't want him to get hit too much.
Remember, we had Sarge on the show. He
exactly
asked me, which quarterback do you think will work better with this offensive line? And I said, well, listen, because of the interior play, guard center guard, I would rather go CJ because of Bryce Young's frame and size.
Exactly.
That kind of scares me a little bit. But now Shaq Mason does kind of help relieve me of the idea of, maybe Bryce Young to Houston is a notion that's going on off 16 and Kirby.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you actually mentioned the interior of that offensive line, because when you go back and you take a look at the play, more so last season, that is where majority of the sacks came from. That is where majority of not helping the run game get to the second and third level. It came due to the inabilities of that interior offensive line. Now you bring in Shaq Mason, John. You know me. My number one attribute that I want to see the Houston Texans provide on that offensive front, outside of talent, is stability. Because when you take a look at that interior, there was a lot of moving parts going on, especially after Justin Britt just disappeared off the face of the earth. Hopefully he's doing okay. But you bring in Shaq Mason, you bringing in a guy who is a veteran, you bringing in a guy that is that you can rely on him to play all 17 games. Not only is he going to give you help in the run game, as you mentioned, John, he's also going to give you help in pass protection. And when you take a look at the potential this offensive line has, you have Laramie Tunsil on the left side. You have Titus Howard on the right side. As of right now, hopefully, prayerfully, it stay like that. When you take a look at the interior, we are expecting Keon Green to take that next step. Well, like I said, talked to him a couple weeks ago. He told me that he's already putting in work to improve his game to get better for this upcoming season. You bring in Shaq, man. I think this offensive line has the potential to be really good for this upcoming season. But I like this move. I think honestly, when you take a look at the moving parts that was going on day 2 of free agency / the new calendar year, or whatever you want to call it, I think that this was one of the most impactful and one of the most important moves for the Houston Texans to make. Because like I said a couple weeks ago, I'm going to say it again here. I'm going to say it again here today. When you take a look at that offensive line, you already know how much you want to rely on the run game. But at the end of the day, you want to put your rookie quarterback, your potential rookie quarterback, in the best position. And of course, to start with the big guys up front.
Absolutely. And this makes this signing really does make the Scott Quisenberry re-signing make sense, right? You look at Scott Quisenberry last year. Was he the greatest? Absolutely not. By no means.
He was decent given the circumstances.
Given the circumstances, and that's what I want to look at, because I think that if the circumstances were different, the word decent would be too much for him, right? But there were moments where the interior offensive line just went through hell. The stretch where we talked about Keon Green playing the top defensive tackles week after week after week after week. I think one week I said the prayer up to God and was like, please bless this young man. And I don't think he answered that prayer that week. But Scott Quisenberry didn't play in the best of circumstances. Now, Shaq Mason does help that idea of, even if we draft a center and go young and cheap, right, where in the next couple of years we have a lot of more money. That's what I want to get to later on in the show, that the Texans, even though they have $40 million this year, guys, the cap that they have for next year is ridiculous. And so we may see Houston wait a year and then go after the more bigger name free agents that make sense for their roster. However, bringing in Shaq Mason, that does allow you to look at the idea of keeping Scott Quisenberry as your starting center until you feel whoever you draft is ready to play ball, right? And this is also based on the fact of the thought of Keon Green getting better. If he plays better, Shaq Mason, who we presume will play better than what we had in AJ Cann in the years prior, then you believe that Scott Quisenberry's job will be a whole lot easier as the center. He had to do a lot last year playing alongside a rookie and AJ Cann, who had moments of playing some good ball, but overall, I think people were disappointed with his play. The start of the end point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to the point scorers and threes drained. FanDuel even allows you to combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with same-game parlays. Don't miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1K in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back in, Locked On Texans listeners and viewers out there in the YouTube world who continues to run those sub numbers up. And so here on the Locked On Texans podcast, we are sincerely grateful. Shout out to anybody that is new to the show. We do this show for you guys and, of course, our lives. Just don't forget, we do this for ourselves. But the Houston Texans did sign Noah Brown. Noah Brown, the former Dallas Cowboy receiver, who, by the way, when you look at Noah Brown, man, he was one of those guys that one of the few developmental guys that I can think of. Like, he got drafted to Dallas 4 to 5 years ago, been in the league for some time now. And last year you saw Noah Brown really hit his stride. Let's see. His first year was in 2017. 33 receiving yards, 54 receiving yards, 154 receiving yards, 184 receiving yards. And then last year on 74 targets, 43 catches, 555 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And he stepped up for Dallas when Dallas didn't have a lot of second options, right? They had a lot of injury issues at their wide receiver position. Started 13 games in 2022. All of those numbers that I just gave you, of course, were career highs. A former 7th-round draft pick. So when I look at Noah Brown, he's a guy that I believe can do a couple of things. He can help with the development of a receiver because he's been in that position. And I like this. I like the signing of Noah Brown. Also, when I look at Noah Brown, I look at another aspect of things. He's 6'2", right? Amari Rodgers is under contract. Amari Rodgers is not a big receiver. John Mechie, who is we can't wait to see him play ball. He's 5'11". He's not a big receiver. The big receivers on the roster right now, outside of Noah Brown, was Nico Collins. No, we still have Brandon Cooks on the roster. And I'm starting to believe that we may see Brandon Cooks in a Texan jersey for the 2023 season. I'm just throwing that out there. And Chris Moore, who is not under contract anymore. With the loss of Phillip Dorsett, they replace a guy that they believe is dependable, and I think Noah Brown can be one of those dependable players. But the biggest thing that I like about the signing of Noah Brown, guys, is even with Robert Woods, I'm reminded of the system Bobby Slowick is trying to recreate here in Houston. And that leads me to a Deebo Samuel 74-yard touchdown against Seattle in the playoffs. When you look at that touchdown, what was important? Why did that touchdown happen?
Blocking
downfield. Brandon Ayuk blocked downfield, freed up Deebo Samuel, and able to go straight line 74 yards to the house. And I think Houston is targeting scheme fit over talent. Now, when we're looking at the wide receiver pool, we all agree that the wide receiver pool lackluster. Right, not big names, not names you will go out there and sign guys to crazy contracts. I mentioned the likes of DJ Chalk, Alan Lazard. Alan Lazard is in New York now for the Jets, I believe. Right, crazy, right? Let me come back from my high. But there were some more talented players out there in the free agent pool. But do those guys fit the scheme that Bobby Slowick is trying to recreate? And Noah Brown was one of those receivers where, with him coming off career highs and him being a pretty good blocker downfield. I mean, like, I went back and watched some of his tape. He does a very good job of blocking downfield for guys in open space, and that's something that you want because blocking downfield does that screams a team player, and that's what they want right now. We open the show up every day now, and to tie it all in, right? We know what they're trying to build. And I think that is why they're going scheme fit over talent. I think Noah Brown is, like I said, one of those good blocking receivers. And I think that he will compete for a roster spot. Only signed a 1-year deal with the Houston Texans. And so we've seen in the past Nick Caserio sign guys in the offseason, and they don't make it to the 16-17 regular season. And it is what it is. But I think right now, is it an underwhelming signing? Yes, it is. And I'm not going to change my mind on that. However, does it fit with what this team is trying to do as from a roster standpoint? Yes, it does. And so from that, They're sticking to their guns, and they're building what they are envisioning. I don't know how much Noah Brown has moved the needle for this wide receiver room. I don't. I really don't. I think from a talent standpoint, there are other guys out there that are much more talented than Noah Brown. And I like Noah Brown. I think Noah Brown, if he makes his roster, could potentially be what Chris Moore was for this team, right? Can come in and make some plays. And when you need him to make a play downfield or across the middle, he can do that for you. Wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 kind of guy. And especially with the loss of Phillip Dorsett, who was important for Houston in the past couple of seasons, you know, he kind of may replace that role, and Chris Moore. Now I'm looking at Chris Moore as a guy that you and I both want it back. Don't think he'll come back now. We'll see how Houston handles that situation. But I'm not signing Noah Brown and Robert Woods and bringing back Chris Moore because I believe that both of those guys are the same. And if they really want to upgrade this wide receiver room, they should have with talent. Not necessarily scheme fit, because your scheme, everybody can fit that scheme. Now I look at the Texans, and overall, I think the Texans will do this for this entire roster. They're signing guys to fill holes right now, and they're going to bring in the talent through the draft.
And that is something that I've been saying. That's why I haven't really put too much thought into the Texans free agency in terms of whether it's underwhelming or whether these are good signings. Because when I take a look at Noah Brown, John, I actually like this signing because, as you just alluded to, you know, he fits the scheme, but he's also a reliable wide receiver. And when you go back and take a look at everything that this organization had to go through with their wide receiving core over the last 2-3 seasons, there was a lot of times where we really didn't know whether or not who's going to be available in that wide receiving core for a majority of the time, except for Brandon Cooks. You know, to go back to the 2020 campaign, what was that wide receiver name that everybody fell in love with? Chad Hansen. Remember Chad Hansen? You know, there was a time where Chad Hansen was this team's number 2 wide receiver behind Brandon Cooks. And like I said, you know, even though
nightmares.
Exactly. And like I keep saying, even though I like Chris Moore here in the city of Houston, I'm still hoping that they can bring him back. And, you know, we know how much Frank Ross loved his special team guys. I still think there is a slim possibility that Chris Moore can come back to the Houston Texans because he also plays some special teams as well. But like I mentioned, when you go back to the game, ironically, against the Dallas Cowboys, you never want to be in a position where Chris Moore is your number 1 target. You never want to be in a position where Chris Moore is finishing the game with over 100 receiving yards. It's nice. Don't get me wrong. I believe he did that like 2 or 3 times throughout his career in Houston. But the fact that there was moments where you had to rely on Chris Moore lets you know how depleted the depth was in this wide receiving core. You take a look at Robert Woods. You take a look at Noah Brown. Both of those guys, I don't think they move the needle as far as wins and loss, but they do move the needle in terms of depth at that position group. Because whether Brandon Cooks here or not, whoever they draft whoever they draft during the draft, you know, my guy from TCU, I'm rooting for him. You talking about size?
I'm glad you said that because like now it seems like does Houston like him based off his size and, you know, not necessarily because he's the best talent. Does he work better for their scheme now when you look at Johnson from TCU? So that's also been running through my head, guys.
The next guy that they can take in the draft that can be your number 1 wide receiver for not just this year, but hopefully in the future, that you can pair with your potential franchise quarterback, you still got to take a look at Jackson Smith-Njigba. So, and for the first time in his tenure as general manager, I like that Nick Caserio is not only going after depth in free agency, but he's also going after guys like Noah Brown, like Robert Woods, to where if the opportunity presents itself, I feel a lot more comfortable with those guys taking the field and providing this team with some type of boost.
Yeah, I'm just not for it right now. I'm not. And this is a general manager who, you know what we've said for Nick Caserio? We've said, well, he doesn't have the money. We've said that. Like for Houston, it's not a destination because of everything that's going on.
It's still not. Don't get me wrong. It's going to take a while for that to happen again.
And it's still not. But we've also said he doesn't have the money. His first year, by God, Bill O'Brien did a horrendous job with these contracts and made it very difficult for this team to make moves. I think one year Nick Caserio took over. I think this is when he took over. That was $20 million over the cap. And he had to come in and make a lot of this moves. And yeah, it was remember that crazy year that Nick Caserio had to maneuver, and we were all impressed by that because he got got money down. But it's constantly been up until this offseason, he doesn't have the money. Now that he has the money, we're still seeing the same pattern. We're still seeing it, which is going to lead me to what I'm going to close out with. And I think he has commitment issues because of the way he in his contracts. I don't know, but we'll get to it before we get out the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. You've heard us talk a lot about the mobile app game here on the show. If you ever thought about becoming a general manager, you got to give this game a try. It's not as easy as you might think to create a dynasty, so check out Ultimate Football GM, where you get an opportunity to control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory, trying to build a historic dynasty. You hire the right coaches and coordinators, manage all of the finances, including negotiating player salaries and terms, even navigating your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, and personnel player issues, all of the ups and downs of a season. Our Locked On listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Thank you for making the Locked On Texans your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parsons and Keith Sanchez provide an in-depth coverage of the biggest NFL draft prospects with deep dives into the sleepers and hidden gems that can change your favorite franchise. Find Locked On NFL Draft wherever you get your podcasts and YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Welcome back in, Locked On Texans listeners and viewers. Before we get out of here today, I know you guys are wondering, what do I mean by Nick Caserio has commitment issues? Well, it just dawned on me. Nick Caserio doesn't sign players over 2 years. He hasn't so far. And I get it in the past. You don't want to, tie yourself to players for too long when the money isn't necessarily the best. But this was the year that I thought he would probably, commit to a player long term. As of right now, outside of his draft picks, of course, as of right now, he hasn't done so. Houston does have a substantial amount of money for next offseason, and maybe that's where we'll see Nick Caserio kind of open up the spending and commitment a little bit for some of the players. But I think that's partial the reason why we're not seeing some of the guys coming to Houston. A 2-year deal doesn't necessarily scream certainty for me if I'm a player. I don't feel like that if I'm a player, I would be able to come here who isn't the best of places already as a franchise, and you're not committing to me long term, right? So we're seeing a lot of guys 3-year deal, 4-year deals, and they're getting their money, which is great. But Houston is still 1-2-year deals, keeping that same trend. Mm-hmm. And if I'm a player in free agency, I'm looking at that and saying to my agent, well, what about next year? Am I going to be safe? Right? Is my job security going to be an issue for this franchise? And then, my money, is it looking funny or not? So I do think that Houston is taking a different approach. As I mentioned earlier, they're going scheme over talent, scheme fit over talent. But Nick Caserio in these 2-year deals, these 2-year deals may be scaring players away because of the lack of security that they'll have with their job.
I think that's a good point, but at the same time, you still got to be a little bit more realistic of why Nick Caserio is probably still handing out these 1- and 2-year deals, because we already know what the situation is with the Houston Texans. We are expecting them to finally take a next step next year, but as of right now, the image of the Texans still isn't that good, unfortunately. You already know you're talking about a team now has only won 11 wins since 2020.
Not good.
11 wins since 2020. So when you factor all of that in, it's like I said on yesterday's show, John, in order for Nick Caserio to truly go after the cream of the crop, in order for Nick Caserio to hand out these long-term contracts and stuff, he's going to have to overpay. You just hinted at the fact that next year is going to be even more money to spend in free agency. And hopefully that is when we finally see Nick Caserio say, I want to sign you to a 4-year deal. I want to sign you to a 3-year deal. I want to sign you to whatever the deal, because we want to build with you for the long term or whatever the case might be. This is still a team that's in the early stages of its rebuild. And to be honest with you, it doesn't matter the sport. It doesn't matter a league. It does take a lot of, look, quote unquote, security in terms of the money aspect in years for a veteran player who can still provide something to be persuaded to come to a rebuilding team. John, when you was talking, it kind of had me thinking about the situation that's going on with the Rockets right now. During the trade deadline, they brought out 3 or 4 veterans, and one veteran, Danny Green, came out and said that he actually wanted to be here in Houston. The Rockets wanted him, but they did not want to commit to him past, I think, next season. And he looking at this from a standpoint, if I'm going to be a part of a rebuilded team that's still not very good, I want at least some security in terms of years and money. And that's basically the same thing that's going on here with the Houston Texans as well. Because, look, like I mentioned, we are expecting this team to take the next step, but at some point, Nick Caserio and hopefully, I pray to God, D'Amico Ryans, they're going to get to the point. Well, they're going to get to the point. Exactly. They're going to get to the point where they're going to look at the young guys that they have excelling, and they're going to get to the point to say, you know what? Let's cut ties with all these. I don't want to say bottom of the barrel because that was 2021 free agency, but they're going to cut ties with a lot of these veterans who, like Scott Quisenberry, like you just said, if given the circumstances, if the Texans were in a better circumstances, decent would not have been a word to describe Quisenberry's play last season. I mean, you could say that for about several of these guys. So I get it, I understand it. I do wish that Nick Caserio was just a little bit more aggressive on the defensive side of the ball, more so when you take a look at improving the front seven. But overall, I just think
by the way, has been the most disappointing.
Yes, I know.
There have been some good guys signed, and I'm looking at
Hassan
Ridgeway, who, don't get me wrong, I think Hassan Ridgeway would be, good for Houston.
Given the circumstances.
But I'm looking at his running mate that I forget his name, Eubank. I forget his name, so excuse me. He was signed up. He had a very good deal. He had 5 sacks last year. Kind of reminds me of Ogbo Okoronkwo. So if you lose one, why not go get another? It's
exactly.
Just when you look at some of the upgrades, you may think to yourself, are you upgrading or are you just filling a void? Thank you guys for checking out today's episode of the Locked On Texans podcast. Be sure to follow us on YouTube under the name Locked On Texans. Follow us on Twitter as well under Locked On Texans, excuse me. And follow me on Twitter at John_Hickman12. It's Wednesday, so you know what that means. It don't mean nothing. It's just hump day. So go hump along. Just hump. Just start humping. Yeah, right there. Hopefully the Texans hump and get some good free agents.
And as always, I'm your host, Cody M. Davis. Please remember to follow me on Twitter at CodyDavis_24. Once again, that's Cody COTYDAVIS_24. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, peace.